we could first open this discussion today on mobile game publishing by talking about sort of the history and what's happened in mobile game publishing to date. And so what we've seen historically is that every big game company has tried mobile game publishing, but not very successfully. And so when we think about companies like Zynga, EA, or even Rovio, they haven't been very successful. And even more recently, in the past year, we've seen high-profile flameouts from companies like Flare Games and even the company that I was working at, NBC Universal. And then we've also seen kind of a shift in business model by some of these companies like Scopely. And so I wanted to talk first with our panelists about kind of this situation, why historically a lot of external third-party mobile game publishing has not been very successful, and then what can we expect in terms of the players in the market today so that we could be more successful today and in the future. And maybe we could start talking with Brent, because at Tilting Point, you guys have a very specific model, and so maybe you could talk about that, and then maybe also introduce yourselves a little bit more as well.
Okay, so again, I'm Brent Wiedmer. I'm the head of game design at Tilting Point. So what we do is we integrate with all of the teams at Tilting Point that we work directly with in code development and live publishing to kind of help them design their game and fill in their holes. And then we evaluate the different markets out there when we look at new games that come in to kind of see where this game fits, check out the data, and see how we think we can scale it. So as to your question, at Tilting Point, we think the original model of live publishing is dead. We don't think it's intelligent anymore. We think that it is just super high risk. Looking at the industry, and you take a game that's pre-launch, soft launch with a small amount of KPIs, and it's pure risk. You don't know if it's actually going to succeed. You can't expect a Clash killer to come out with every new game you're looking at. So at Tilting Point, what we do now is we take a game that's live, or maybe it's been in soft launch for a long amount of time, and we have the data already. And so we can evaluate the data, we know our strengths, and we know exactly how well we can scale the game, and we can evaluate the game from a straight P&L perspective. So we think that's kind of the new wave of publishing now, which is looking at pure data-driven and kind of knowing the outcome before you get into it, really minimizing the risk.
Yeah, so I think we've had our fair share of conversations with multiple publishers, and in our journey of making games, we realized that the typical deals were like all or nothing, and that would mean that a 50-50 split of the revenues and the bulk of the risk when the developer has taken bulk of the risks, and then you bring a game to a stage where it's ready for launch, and that's not something you want to hear. So those are deal breakers. And the kind of value that one would bring to the table is extremely important, because so if potentially if the game needs certain infusion of certain talent, I think that's the value that the publisher brings in. But then in our case, it was more about, we built the game, we soft launched it ourselves, we kind of knew where the game was heading. We launched it as well. I mean, before that, we had a lot of these long conversations, and then none of them made sense to us. At that point in time, we decided to kind of, and thankfully the stores were, at least favorable in our terms, at least featuring us and stuff like that. But then eventually, it was all about going with your gut instincts and publishing the game. Post-launch, we realized that the game needs to scale, and that's where we had a lot of inbound VC interest in kind of looking at the kind of money the game was making.
Got it. And in terms of, just for our audience, so they kind of understand some of the models that are out there, just kind of high level from my perspective, it sounds like there's this model that Scopely has, which is, they kind of come up with a concept, they kind of fund from a very early stage, and then it seems like their model has shifted after, IUGA and Walking Dead, where they want to have a model where they can acquire the studio. So that's kind of one model. You've got kind of the super scale model, which is really around being kind of like, they don't like to call themselves a publisher, more like a white label publisher. They don't need to be publisher of record. And it sounds like, their specialty is mainly focused on, UA and then sales and analytics. And then, you've got companies like Tilting Point where, at least from a high level, The sort of common view is that there's like a heavy, deep expertise, more focus on UA. But Amit, I was hoping you could kind of talk a little bit more about some of the different models that you've seen. Is that a good sort of categorization in terms of some of the primary models out there?
Yeah, I think there's the fourth category, which is basically, you just launch the game and try to see if it works or not.
Right.
And we have had our, experiences with those kind of publishers as well. Yeah, so the thing is, I think from a developer point of view, I think it's pretty much these models, and I think one needs to look at what the game needs or what's the studio's need, and in our case, clearly it was user acquisition and scale, and we were scouting for publishers who kind of could slice and dice their offerings. We knew that we had a strong grip on the product and the data and analytics. Where we clearly needed help was user acquisition, because that requires a certain amount of tech, that requires a certain amount of experience, and of course, the creative team that needs to run all that. And that kind of so I think at least at that point in time, Tilting Point was the only publisher who was offering that slice and dice approach of a model. The other side of things were the conversations were it starts with the deal structure first, and then we are not even talking about the game and what the game needs. So that doesn't infuse any confidence in the developer, because if it's going to be an experiment, we might as well do the experiment ourselves. So I think and what's important for us is, I think at least when we signed up with Tilting Point was I think we were one of the first or the second games that Tilting Point signed up, and we were so we flew down to New York and met the entire team, and we saw that there was a team which had like significant amount of background building those games and scaling those games, and that kind of builds a lot of confidence. And everything, data was central. I think we were hitting like direct ROAS at like D3 in the initial tests, and so we knew for a fact that the games can scale, and all those tests kind of validated all of that. So I think if the relationship between a publisher and developer is very fluid, and they're going to go to any extent to infuse that confidence, I think that kind of works.
Got it. And just kind of thinking a little bit more high level in terms of even like the role of the publisher. At the highest level, you can kind of think of the role of the publisher as sort of a few different things, right? So kind of like financial support, marketing and UA, potentially IP, and then, Brent, you're kind of a design lead, right? And so potentially like product design support, for example. Would you guys agree that those are the four primary areas? Is there something that I'm missing?
I think it's all about the LTV, and I think at the end of it, if whatever it takes, I mean, if increasingly live ops is becoming central for operating any of the games, and if the studio has the bandwidth to kind of grow the LTV and keep at it, then sure, I mean, why not? But then if you think that you want to invest your time in building your second and third game, and you can't do justice to that particular game, then there is value that the publisher can bring in. So I think it's pretty much a choice as to what the developer intends to do. As far as the cash flow is concerned, I think the funding model of UA, it kind of it works in the favor of the developer, because if we are doing user acquisition on our own, we're talking about 60 to 90 days of a window for your operating cash flows. And for a studio, that can be a lot. And if you're talking about scale, it can be a significant amount. So all of that is off your shoulders. And then if you look at it, there is a combined entity of the knowledge of operating multiple games from a publisher's point of view. And there's a lot of cross-learning that is happening between So let's say that there's a particular campaign in one of the casual games which is doing extremely well, that can be immediately replicated in the rest of the games as well.
Right, so kind of like the Zynga talks a lot about finding some best practice or mechanic in one game and then just kind of taking it to all of their games, for example.
That's right.
Something like that. And then the other question I had is just trying to take more situational context in mind when we think about different genres. So different genres of games have different sort of publishing requirements or keys to success. And so, Brent, from your perspective, I wanted to ask you in terms of like, so hyper casual games, for example, they only think about CTR as a key metric or D1 retention. And then, there may not even be a soft launch. And so for different genres of games, how do you think about, what's required or how you're evaluating these games or what, from a publishing perspective, how do you think about those different genres?
So, I mean, each genre is its unique gem, right? And the idea from a publisher standpoint is you have to know what you can specialize in, know kind of the metrics you're looking to see from each genre, but then also knowing the game itself. So you have to tie the game to those metrics and kind of understand, okay, this game we think can achieve this, and this is this game's, ultimate where this game can be and fit in the market. So yeah, in hyper casual, it's all about just getting the users in, keeping them as long as they can for as cheap as you can, and that's the way to go. But for like a 4X game in SLG, you're going to see really a lot lower day one retention, but then it's all about the long tail of that user. Yeah.
So I think from our point of view, hyper casual is extremely tough because, potentially a studio could generate like one hit in its lifetime, but from a publisher's point of view, they're sourcing hit games from multiple studios. So on an aggregate basis, the publisher is always at an advantage. But then that can't be a business model for a studio. And especially so because the entry to barrier for hyper casual games is extremely low. I was telling you about this where, we pitched a game to a publisher on a hyper casual game to a publisher. And while these conversations were going on, they just released the exact same game in their market. So there are those experiences as well. So, but then I think if hyper casual, I don't think it's data driven. It's just about whatever works for the audience. I mean, you're just potentially looking at D1 retention there. And slightly more deeper gameplays. So you're looking at live ops centric games. So there's heavy reliance on how you would operate the game. So yeah, I think those would be the two major distinctions. Mid-core and hardcore games, I think those go into a completely different tangent where the production life cycles are extremely huge. And then obviously, I think the soft launch and the launch itself becomes extremely critical. So I think those games rely heavy on the marketing aspect of it, where publisher could add tremendous value there.
So I wanted to now talk about the typical working relationship between a publisher and a developer. And certainly there are different models out there, right? And so like Scopely is kind of famous for sending a team to the studio and co-locating for months on end. And then there are other, game publishers that are known for just having like a weekly, really quick call. And so maybe Brent, starting with you, could you talk about how do you guys work with your studios in terms of like, the frequency of meetings, the types of meetings, things of that nature. And then after you, Brent, like maybe you could talk about your own experience in terms of how you've worked with publishers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of Tilting Point's strengths is that we kind of cater to the needs of the developer. So depending on the project and the developer, we'll set up how many meetings we need to have. On generally, it's 1 to 2 meetings a week, and depending on the stage the game is in, we'll fly a team out there, just like I'm out here now at a meeting with our partners to work with the game and really integrate for a week to get on the same page, to get aligned. And some developers, they have gaps in their strengths, of course. So we'll take our art team, for example, and help out an art pipeline that is not meeting the deadlines and the expectations that we're looking for. Or we'll take in a design team that's got some experience in the industry and the genre to kind of help guide if we think the metrics are off or something in soft launch. So it's really about the needs of the developer, and we're not too hands-on. We don't want to like push and say, you know, our way or the highway, because we want our developers to maintain their own identity, and that's kind of how we build really good relationships with the developers we work with.
I think it's increasingly clear that the kind of attention games needs these days. I think the integrated approach works best because that's what the games need, and it's all about the best idea in the room wins, right? So, and if that's the approach, I think, and games, you put games first and not about who's leading the development or who's leading the publishing. It's not about all that. I think it's in everybody's interest to kind of get the game right, and if it works for everyone. So I think what we've seen in our experience is that if the game is led to be developed in a silo where there's absolutely no back and forth conversations, you're not using the best of the potentials of the combined entity. And so what we've seen is that, at least in the core dev that we've been working with Tilting Point, is that the best of our teams are on that project, and we know for a fact that there is a certain amount of time that the game will take to kind of build all those systems and the kind of design that does justice to the kind of IP that we're going with. So it's more about working backwards from what the goals are and trying to see how we can leverage on each of the strengths and go from there.
Got it. And I think an important question to ask is really around expectations from the developers to the publishers. And so, I think especially for young or early companies that get a publishing deal, they kind of think of it as a magic bullet that, like, yeah, we've got a publishing deal, we're going to be super successful. So I was hoping that both of you guys could talk about what should the expectations be after you get a publisher. What does that mean to the developer? Maybe starting with you, Brent.
It depends a lot on the developer. So a lot of the times when we sign up with a new developer that, maybe they've made one game a moderate success, and now we've begun scaling their game, and they don't necessarily, know what to do anymore. They're, okay, now my game is blowing out of proportion. How do I develop? What do I develop? How do I, upgrade my team to be able to do this? And, that's where, as a publisher, we need to come in and help and say, okay, this is what we think is going to work for you. You should probably focus on this. In the meantime, we can, lend you some support. And these are the kind of metrics you need to focus on, and focusing your development on that point. So it's about kind of grounding yourself when you find out you have a developer, finding out then just take it a step at a time. What do we need to focus on next? Be data-driven and find out what to do.
Great.
Yeah, so I think definitely, it's not a magic bullet. I think it's start of a relationship. I think it's more about what the studio is expecting from the relationship, and to derive value out of it. I've seen a lot of cases where the team is very excited about a publishing deal, and eventually it could tilt both ways, right? I mean, there's a publisher who could take the game into a completely new direction and run down the studio, or the game is extremely averse to kind of accommodating the kind of vision the publisher is bringing to the table, and then fall flat. So there are those both extremes. I think the publishing deal is more about it's let's call it the exploration stage before we get to the actual launch of the game. So you're just trying to figure out what works best for the game. So as long as it's an integrated approach where you're thinking about all aspects of the game, like the art of it, the science of it, and the commerce of it, and then just tap on the potential that each one brings, it could work.
And then let's also talk about deal terms. And I don't want you guys to tell us specific deal terms in terms of what you guys have, but just industry-wide, just kind of like industry benchmarks. maybe we could talk about how typical deals are structured, and what could some of the developers here that are trying to structure deals with publishers, what should they expect?
So, I mean, I don't know necessarily about the other publishers in the industry from a game design perspective, but as far as how Tilting Point works, we definitely work with our developer to make sure that both sides are getting what they want. So I know one of the hot topics nowadays is, and you've covered in your podcasts, is recouping on organics for a UA fee deal. And that really comes down to what the developer is looking for in their game. So if the developer is very much looking forward to protecting their profits, yeah, they should be looking to make a deal where they don't allow the publisher to recoup on any of the organics. But if there's a game that just wants to scale, they just want to take their game to the extent that it can go, then if you unlock the publisher to recoup on organics, then the publisher can then spend a lot more money on the UA and really see how far you can take it. But it's really very much about finding what works for you as a developer, and then finding a publisher that's willing to accommodate you and your needs. Okay, so in a typical UA fee deal, we would spend, let's say, $100 on user acquisition, and we would recoup a percentage of that as the profit or the fee for doing the UA, for spending the money on that, and for the services we do, like creatives and whatnot. Recouping on organics is, if that is not profitable, then the publisher needs to still recoup their money. And that would be where we would take the money, then cut into the organics. If the publisher is making a deal where they don't recoup on organics, then we would not recoup on that in any way, shape, or form. But that would also force us to be more careful in how we're spending and scaling the game, because we want to make sure that both parties are absolutely profitable under all circumstances.
Yeah, maybe I could also take a shot at explaining this to you. So when you think about a mobile game and the installs or downloads that come to a mobile game, there are kind of two pieces, right? And so you can pay to get a user into your game. That's your paid installs. And then there are just organics, people that come from the App Store, people who are kind of searching. And so those are your organics. Now, the tricky part of this is, and so both the paid installs and the organic installs will make money, and how that money is divvied up is kind of a key question. But also, when you pay for an install, typically speaking, there is some viral component, right? And so you pay for an install, and that person that installed might, might tell a friend to install the game, or might invite friends or whatever. And so that the tricky part is, how do you account for the organics, and then how do you actually measure what that sort of viral factor or organic factor is? So that's the tricky part there. The argument that could be made by the developer is, I'm going to get these organic installs anyway. So if you as a publisher are doing the marketing and paying for user acquisition, they only want to give them credit for the paid installs, right? That would be what a developer thinks. And there's a little bit of back and forth on that, but different publishers are going to treat those organics in different ways.
I think traditionally there's been the 50-50 deals where basically, publisher says, okay, these are the things that we're going to do the game, and then that's the rev share we talk about, and that's a failed model, right? So we've seen that, and there's enough number of cases where that's never taken off, and there's a new age of publishers where they're saying, you know what, just let's look at the game, and kind of, if we're looking at profitability versus scale or whatever the studio needs to do, and that's going to be the single objective. And those are the kind of models which are kind of emerging and kind of making a lot of sense for the developers. Because if we, there are those evangelists out there who are very vocal about most of the money being raised in the VC world is predominantly going in the pockets of Facebook and Google, right? And that's a fact. It's and there's the 30% rev share that the platform would take, and then there's the US spend, and then you're talking about profitability, which leaves very little for the developer. So, and unless it's a game of scale, it's increasingly becoming a winner takes all market. So which uh, puts the kind of onus on the developer and the publisher to kind of look at what the vision is of the game, and it need not necessarily be, I mean, we're not even talking about the top 100 games, right? Because that's a different league of its own. Even if you're operating at a certain threshold where you're, um, you know, let's say sub 500, sub 1000 category, but still maintaining profitability, I think that's a good place to be.
And then maybe we could also kind of dig into, Brent raised a good point in terms of, when you're trying to structure a deal with a publisher, one of the things to look out for, which is this point around how you account for organics. But, and I know you've mentioned that you've talked to Klaus, the former CEO of Flare Games, and, he's kind of written a blog post on a lot of things that you should watch out for. But could you kind of, from your perspective, what are some other like tricky things that developers should look out for from a deal structure perspective when they're kind of working on that contract or that deal with a publisher?
Sure. So I think the first question that creeps up is that there's a certain user acquisition will bring in a certain delta of organics into the game, and a developer would normally think that I was expecting those organic skills to be there in the game any which way. And then there is the featuring angle of it, where you say, okay, let's say if there was no user acquisition, but then I'm expecting a certain a DAO to come in based on featuring. So those are the ones which should tend to kind of make the things a little bit cloudy in terms of how do you look at it. But from what we have seen is that there's definitely a delta which inorganics bring in to organics. And from our experience, we've seen it could be anywhere in the range of 1.4 to 1.6x of the scale. And then how do you account for the entire UA pool that is going in for the month-on-month scale that we're looking at? So I think the bottom line is that if you're looking at profitability, it's all about what is your recoupment window. So it could be 30 days or 90 days or 180 days. And if that's the kind of threshold the studio can have, then, so the game can scale quite a bit. There is the other extreme where people say that, okay, I'm just going to look at scale because these are numbers I need to show my VC. Then I don't think they care about bottom lines. So they're talking about, whatever it takes to kind of get to that scale.
Right. And maybe if I could throw in something as well, one thing that trips up a lot of game developers is just when they get paid. And so, when publishers pay for UA, and it takes Google and Apple some time to pay them, and then they recoup. And so some developers do get surprised at how long it takes before they see any cash. And so if you're trying to manage cash for a small dev studio, please watch out for that when you're structuring your deal, or you could get into trouble. But we are kind of running out of time here, so I thought we could end with one last question in terms of, like, in your experience working as a publisher and working as a developer, what would be the kind of single piece of advice that you'd want to give some of the people in our audience in terms of, like, mistakes made or things to watch out for, just generally speaking?
I'd say probably it would be just keep an open mind to most everything you're doing, because when we go in and talk with a developer, they've always bring an avenue of something that we don't expect. Like, they look at a game from the way that we don't expect, and we need to be able to account for that. Same thing with a developer going to a publisher. Like, there's a UA avenue where we're getting a certain type of user that you would never have expected to get into your game. And so just keep an open mind to what potential new audiences might come in, what potential new avenues to look at your game, and it might need to adjust a development process or a relationship process in order to make it work from there on.
Got it. Yeah.
So I think you need to put the vision of the game first. I think if the vision of the game is set, see if there's going to be value which can be tapped on from the relationship. And if anything that is going to compromise that vision, I think just stay away from it.